We are live? Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of In the Box. So, as you know, in the box, we always try to bring you contextual knowledge on certain topics. How does a startup grow from the local reality, starting out locally, and scale across other countries, across sub Saharan Africa, across Africa? And today we have two experts with us. I will give them the opportunity to introduce themselves. So we are starting firstly with Jeremy. Jeremy, if you can briefly introduce yourself. Thanks.
Hi, Daniel. Hi, Nick. My name is Jeremy Koino. I am based, born, raised in Ghana. I'm currently the CEO for Jumo in Ghana and General Manager for Jumo Africa. So, very simply, Jumo is a large fintech player that partners with large banks and mobile network operators to deliver financial services. So, the easiest example of our products in Ghana, if you're familiar with any of the loan products on MTN Mobile Money menu, so Quick Loan, Express Loan, Ahomka Loan, Bosia Loan, those are all products that Jumo has provided. So, happy to be here. It's been a journey getting to this point, and happy to share some of the insights that we've gleaned along the journey.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. Thanks so much. And our second guest is Nicholas. So, Nicholas, also the floor is yours.
Thank you, Daniel. And hi, everyone. My name is Nicholas Clark. Um, and thanks a lot for the team at Boxplay Ventures. Great guys. I currently represent Renew Capital in Ghana, where I manage our investment activities in Ghana and across West Africa. So, Renew Capital, we're a venture capital firm or we're an investment firm. That is more of an ecosystem first type of investment firm where we source deals across the continent and we back founders who are essentially willing to change the continent as fast and as impactful as we want to. Our ticket sizes, we could always jump into that, but I feel like for now, I'll just leave it at a very quick intro so we dive in.
Okay, sounds good. And I think it's a good combination. We have somebody who is like really, if I can describe it in that sense, on the field, doing what we are talking about, and kind of building the enabling environment and supporting the players on the ground, which from experience, I know both are very tough jobs. So basically, my first question I would say is like, I would like to understand what do you think is maybe common misconception that people have when maybe like a startup, let's say, let's use Ghana as an example. Let's say you start out in Ghana, you have found some level of product market fit, things are going all right. And then you think, yes, we have the rest of Africa to conquer. What are kind of major misconceptions that founders or investors have? I would like to send that question to Jeremy first.
Sure. So there's a number of misconceptions, right? It's difficult to gain any kind of traction in any kind of market. So as soon as you start to see that you have that product market fit, all of a sudden your eyes start to glisten and you start thinking about, unicorn status, becoming the next big multi-regional conglomerate. But I think that it's really about, and I think the local saying is you need to be able to own your own streets before you start to try and expand into other markets. And what I mean by that is sometimes getting product market fit is good because it shows traction, but you also need to make sure that you're actually embedded within the ecosystem. Sometimes you've gotten traction because people are, let's call it, tolerating your product till they find something else that is better, that is more embedded within the ecosystem. So if your product is the type that is similar to ours, you need to make sure that you have regulatory goodwill, that you do not have to worry about the regulator coming to get you if you decide to take your eyes off your home country, right? Looking at our product is funded by the banks. So you need to have really strong banking relationships that are entrenched. You need to entrench yourself within the strategy and life cycle of the partner as well, so that your survival is key to them as well, because it actually generates value for them. And then you also have to have a deep cultural insight and understanding of the market that you're in. If you're in Ghana and you understand that, yes, there's certain things that work really well in Ghana, but there's some things that are just no goes if you want to do certain things, right? We found in Ghana, for example, that if you want to grant out loans to the mass market, to people at the bottom of the pyramid, it's better you go the USSD route because people are very familiar with mobile money, than go the app route because most people just cannot afford the data to, generate the kind of internet-based, transaction that you need. Now, if you don't have these things in place and you decide that since this has worked in Ghana, I'm going to another market, and you follow that same thought process, you most likely will be sent back home crying. So the first thing is if you have that embeddedness in the ecosystem, if you have that local regulatory understanding, goodwill embedded with the partnerships, understanding of the operations of your country, and then you, the founder yourself, can your company run without you being there? If you leave the market for a month and things are going to be falling apart, right? You are so integral to the company that things cannot run without you. Then the machine cannot survive without you. Then you're not ready. So those are some of the misconceptions that the product market fit is all you need. And I think that it's a whole lot more than that. So that's my 2 cents for now. I think we'll go into more detail as we go along.
Yeah, I mean, it makes a lot of sense to me. But then, I mean, I've been on both sides, on the ecosystem building side and also on the side of startup, and also have gone through the mill in terms of having facing the startup side, and I think there's sometimes also pressures in terms of like the investors want to see or hear how you can roll across the continent. And then there's, of course, the realities that Jeremy is describing. So maybe when I threw out a conception on the founder side or investor side, maybe Nicholas, maybe from your perspective, what are your thoughts on the same question? What are certain misconceptions or maybe even expectations from investors, and how does a founder work with that?
Right. Thank you for that, and super brilliant ideas from Jeremy as well, who's worked on the field and on the ground in terms of building a company from the ground up. For me, from where I sit, I feel like I see quite a number of companies, and one thing we're pretty mindful about is Africa is not one market. So that's a huge misconception where it's assumed that this is it's a very good ring. This is a product for Africa by Africa. These are very interesting rings, but Africa is not one market. Rwanda's landscape is totally different from what Ghana's landscape will look like. There might be similarities, but more often than not, the differences far outweigh the similarities across different countries, not just from a language perspective, which is like Francophone, Anglophone Africa, but purely from even what Jeremy mentioned from a cultural perspective as well. Because I don't know, it's easy to say something that worked in Ghana could work in Nigeria because first of all, in your mind, you've clustered it under Anglophone West Africa, but Nigeria is a different game. It's a different animal. It's a different beast altogether. I think another one would be, well, based on the strategy investors usually ask, so what is your plan to scale A and B solution to the rest of the continent? It's, well, your plan today would not be the same plan for tomorrow. That question pretty much is under the assumption that the market will be static in different countries as you are speaking or as you are pitching. But the reality is the markets are never static. You would assume this product and your go-to-market strategy is fail-proof. It's airtight till next year. Somebody throws a wrench in your plans. The government changes, policies change. There's a new player in town who has expanded to your country. All these are different dynamics that is eventually keep the machine running, but it can also break your business if you decide to just come with the mentality that this is a strategy we had 5 years ago and this is the same strategy we're going to stick to today. So I feel like, yeah, in terms of that, I'll just say markets are not static. The misconception is that markets don't change. The strategy will remain the strategy, but as a founder, you have to be adaptable. You need to always iterate, which for me should be the fun part of the business because now you're learning, you're getting better. And once you have the mindset that Africa is not one market, you can design, I'm not saying design a whole suite of products for different markets, but you can tweak your products per market and achieve that product market fit Jerry was talking about earlier.
think there's probably a lag on Daniel's side.
Yeah, I have a feeling.
Yeah. Okay. It's yeah. It was lagging a bit, but I think I'm back. Sorry, guys. I'm on the move. I'm actually just visiting. Like I was at one of my have been fa- have been facing.
It's definitely a lag.
Yeah,
And I
definitely
feel like even in
breaking up.
terms of what scaling means, I think there is like quite some differences in how do people even understand what scaling is. And in terms of scaling in Africa, what are the options? Maybe there are options not just in terms of going into other countries, but just scaling in African or sub-Saharan context. What do they mean, and what we are? How does success look like, or what are examples of success stories?
Sorry, Daniel, was the question directed at me or Nick?
I think it should be for you, Jeremy. I'll just come after you.
Yeah, sorry, guys, because I was struggling with the internet. My mind didn't even go there. I would say, yeah, if Jeremy can take the question first.
Sure. So it was breaking quite a bit, but I think you're asking how do you scale? What are some of the success stories? Is that like a good summary? Yeah. So I think in our case, and maybe just to clarify, right? In my role with Jumo, I didn't build it from ground up. The foundations were already built by the founder. I came in to basically to scale it. So some of the foundational things were already there. We didn't come up with, let's say, a grand plan and a pitch deck and, like you said, a go-to-market strategy for each of the other markets. We basically looked at the system that existed and we plugged into the system. Our product is essentially built on partnerships and the rails of others. So we are selling into a different distribution partners ecosystem. So we looked at some of the local giants like the MTNs and the banks who already had the customer base and the relationships, and we didn't go solo. So what we did was we leveraged those distribution partners. We first started like in Ghana with a single product, single partner, single market, try to do it really well, try to make sure that we're reaching the kind of scale that is going to show you the traction, to show you that you're actually solving a need that people have, and then decided, okay, if we've been able to get an African customer who has this problem, who has this need, and we are seeing that this is going to become the future of inclusive, let's call it inclusive banking, then why don't we look for similar markets, right? You have to look for similarities with the market that you've done well in. Like you're saying, if you try to do a copy and paste between Ghana and Nigeria, you'll be burning your fingers because whereas Ghana is a very large mobile money market and it's similar for East Africa and co, if you go to Nigeria, the banks rather were the ones to take the lead and they have very sort of progressed payments infrastructure. So you can't go and copy and paste a microcredit product in Nigeria and hope that it will work. When it comes to a market that has different nuances, you have to tweak, you have to adjust, you have to understand those local differences and adjust your product to that. Where we had success would be in a market like Zambia, where there's similarities, right? The same telco is present in Ghana, is present in Uganda. So you have the system that is extending to another country. So you can basically show the success of one market into another market. The partner is on board. You also look for the large distribution partner who is also there. So if you partner, let's say, with EcoBank or ABSA in Ghana, you look to a country that has the same kind of partners, and it makes it easier for you to replicate the same solution. The main thing about scaling that gives you success is if you are able to make sure that your product is watertight. Because if it is still, let's call it duct tape together, then all you're going to be doing is exporting that chaos, right? And we've had instances of that, right? So that's not a success story. That's more of a horror story where we didn't have the product, well put together. We tried to replicate the same in another market. The market was harsher than your home market, it. Another market you don't, and the product just broke, right? You're just exporting the inefficiency, exporting the chaos, and it's a bad look. So it's important to make sure that if your product is not a standalone, it plugs into the system. You go with the right partners that you can ride off their rails. You sell the value proposition that has worked in similar markets, and that is how you are able to cross borders efficiently. Just to touch on the point that you made about the investors, yes, there's a lot of pressure from the investors to see that you are replicating your product in different markets. But I think that investors are also reasonable human beings. So timing and balance is quite important. In some cases, you can show your investor that you have not penetrated the market to the extent that is available. If you show the market opportunity and what percentage you are reaching and how much more you could be making in your market if you continue to stay the course, I think they will understand, whilst also giving them sort of an estimation of when let's call it the stars will align to make sure the market penetration in other territories are ready. So you have to balance it with showing traction, showing market opportunity, but also letting them know that the investigations, regulatory landscape, the customer how do you call it? Customer intelligence is being acquired in other markets, so that once the time is right, once you have the lock and seal in the home market, then you can move on. So I think it's a balancing act, but it's not impossible.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. Um, yeah, and I mean that makes a lot of sense. But I guess in terms of scaling across African countries, there's also other aspects, and maybe we could go in maybe into cultural and language aspects, and maybe also trying to find out what are some of the challenges and or opportunities that you have seen from a cultural or language perspective. Maybe this question first to Nicholas.
Thank you for that. I'm sure you remember the Anglophone example I gave earlier, which is Ghana, Nigeria, two Anglophone countries in West Africa. Just from a regional clustering perspective, these look like, lower hanging fruits. It would be easier for me to tweak a product to suit the language I'm already launching a product in. I think we even had a session on Saturday where there was a health tech startup, but then in terms of English being a solid language, but then you try to make that a representative of the entire market, it becomes a huge flaw in your business. You'd realize your adoption rates would drop, or you wouldn't even get enough customer acquisition for you to even have any form of attrition. It's very important to take into consideration not just the language part, but then there's also even spending behavior patterns, just the cultural perspective. So, for example, if I was launching a product, there's this term Ghana Nigerians tend to use in terms of traveling outside. They call it Japa, right? If I'm creating a product and I want to create a solution that helps people to migrate or to immigrate to other countries, you'd be very surprised. East Africans are not exactly as, I wouldn't say aggressive, but they're not exactly as jumpy when they hear about Japan. They love their country. They just want to stay there and work there for as long as they want to. But most youth in Ghana, when you hear the conversations on social media, a bit on the Twitter X handles, you realize people tend to want to travel often. So if you think your product is going to suit this because maybe it's just the language thing, everybody understands English, it's a very huge flaw. There's a cultural aspect to it, which is spending patterns. Jeremy mentioned in terms of the infrastructure, which is the banks. Some banks are actually more affected than mobile money in some markets. You have to be always aware of these. I wouldn't call them little, but in hindsight, you would spend a lot of time building and you forget one key element, and that makes or breaks your entire strategy. You'd have to go back to the drawing board and rebuild, reconfigure. It becomes an expensive venture in the long term when you don't do enough, I wouldn't say due diligence, but enough understanding of the market. A vivid example is there's a company we invested in Rwanda called Sour Energy. They essentially provide affordable energy solutions to businesses. So they are selling energy as a service, right? So for them, we did a bit of work for them last year where they wanted to expand. They're currently in Rwanda and Uganda, which is, I'm sure you can tell, the East African community. So in terms of moving goods and services across, it's a lot easier because that's what the whole community is about. But for them, they wanted to understand, where do we move next if we want to move next? So we did a bit of research for them in terms of market expansion. There are different criteria they tend to look at. They look at maybe usage in terms of kilowatts, the grid, off-grid times. They want to see there's an opportunity there or not, and then they try to understand the nuance on the market. So what does that look like from people's perspective? Do they pay for electricity monthly? Do they pay for it on the go, like in Ghana, where you can prepay for your power? So all these things fit into the whole broad cultural concept, which I'm sure on the ground you'd realize it's a bigger problem than you'd imagine. One thing you could miss could eventually take you back a couple of months in terms of building, hitting the market, and launching.
Okay, yeah, that's, I mean, super insightful. And I was also thinking around like what Jeremy said earlier in terms of if you haven't built out your product, your system fully, and it's like still in quotes, I think you use duct taped and you export it, you are going to export that and then it becomes a horror show. But now, even in the instance, for instance, let's say you have fully built your system, it's working, you have maybe built certain things in terms of scalability. But then at that stage, still in terms of cultural nuances, the languages, how do you go about that? Because there might be things that you have built that and it seems to be perfectly working. So how do you have maybe examples of like again highlighting some of the things that Nicholas said in terms of cultural and language?
Yeah, I 100% agree with a lot of things of everything that Nicholas said. When it comes to scaling across borders, I think even for those of us here, we understand that the language, the culture is everything. And the language is not just about the words, it's about, let's say, the context, the emotion. So you could have a very well tuned and productive application or product, but the way you sell it is really going to be what informs whether the decision on the customer side is going to be a yes or a no. You have to be very aware that obviously Africa isn't just one market, right? It's a continent of nuances. In Zambia, for example, if you're given a loan product, they have a lot of farmers, and so they need you to adjust your credit cycle to meet their farming crop cycle. So if you said in Ghana, I was giving a short-term 30-day loan, because everybody seems to take that and it works for them, and you go into a market where they are predominantly farm folk, it's not really going to work. You need to be able to understand the context in that market, and that goes beyond just the language. It's just their culture. They have a farming culture, right? In Ghana, you'd be surprised that funerals are very, very important to people. People actually take loans for funerals. And when I say people, I'm talking about people at the bottom of the pyramid who you would think do not have money to make ends meet. But despite all of that, they take money for funerals. So you do a survey and you realize that if you tag it with some sort of funeral cliche, I like the example that Nicholas said. You go to Nigeria, you're talking about an immigration app or an immigration app. As soon as you add the tagline Jackpot to the app, they know that you understand their culture. And because of that, somebody is going to take a liking towards you and want to sort of give you an opportunity to sort of bring your product into the market. Right. In our part of the world, you have to know who you are before you go approach certain people, right? The three of us here are young guys. You go and you're trying to talk to a regulator, and the regulator already sees you as their grandson. He's looking at, these boys having a beard. Are they serious at all? Look at Daniel with his bun. So you know that in that instance, you've already been given a low score and you have to work your way up. You have to leave your ego at the door. And the cultural element there is you lead with a lot of humility, lead with a lot of respect. Let them see that despite what they're seeing visually, you understand the local culture. You understand that you are the youth engaging the old person because he's the one going to give you the keys to the door. So those things are very important, right? You go to Cote d'Ivoire, you go to the Francophone territories, you can't just translate what you're trying to say from English to French, right? It's easy to do that, but they need you, they need to feel like you understand the culture. So talking about their food, talking about their music, their dances, it's a way to connect that goes beyond just speaking the language the right way. Because you can just go and say, "Oh, je m'appelle Jeremy Quenu, j'apprends le français," and they will hear what you're saying, but you're not really saying much to them because they cannot connect. So it's important to be quiet, to listen, to observe, and tailor your approach to scaling to each of these markets. And that is what buttresses the amazing product you have, and then opens the door for you. So that's been our experience.
Yeah, I mean, it makes a lot of sense. And I mean, for me, as somebody who like grew up like majorly in Switzerland and then came here, I would have needed a lot of what you just said at an earlier stage to understand. So it really is important. And I mean, the thing is, I think you mentioned humility. I think in startup life, entrepreneurship life, humility, I
Yeah.
always tell people is key across so many things because you can't never
Mm.
assume you know. You always have to learn, and you always have to be adapting. But I mean, we have spoken about a few of the aspects, but I think when you speak around scaling, of course, one thing that comes to mind is the African Free Trade Agreement. And yeah, I'm actually very interested to hear how or even if it has impacted on the ability to scale, especially tech ventures. Maybe Jeremy, if you can also go into that a bit.
Sure. So honestly speaking, I would still say that AfCFTA is a work in progress, right? The vision is bold, but the reality is that the execution has been slow. As you can imagine, if regulators and the bureaucracies are coming together to try and make something happen, it's not going to be fintech fast, right? It's not even bank fast. It's regulator fast, which is quite slow. So for fintechs and financial services, the protocols are still lagging behind. We are still having to face country by country licensing, country by country engagements. That said, it has opened the dialogue and it has encouraged some more, harmonization. It's a foundation that we can build on. It's not yet a game changer for us, but we are playing the long game to see that it will reap the dividends. So what we are doing is trying to make sure that we have our voice in the conversations, highlighting where the gaps exist and what some of the players have been able to do that can be leveraged. But for now, it's still, it's still in the long term. So yeah, it's good, but it's not materialized fully yet.
Yeah, I can imagine. But maybe just as a follow up to that, I don't know whether, in your experience, whether you have experienced any country where you feel maybe in the fintech space where, like, yes, the regulation or the collaboration with regulators and government agencies was just working comparatively well, and how that maybe enabled growth or even expansion into a market versus some others. Maybe if you have some thoughts on that, Jeremy.
Sure. I think that it's difficult to say one market has like the most ideal. It depends on the product you're offering. It depends on who you meet in the regulatory office, right? I can say in Ghana, there is a clearly delineated fintech and innovation office, so you don't have to struggle to find who to engage. That said, it doesn't mean that the policies are so straightforward and easy to acquiesce to. So you have the advantage that you have a clearly delineated fintech and innovation office with policies and standards. They even have a fintech sandbox. They create all of these enabling environmental things that you need, but you still have to make sure that you can meet these. In a different market that doesn't have as much structure, like Guinea, you're able to get a license for, let's say, a credit nano credit products on digital platforms in like a month, which you will not get in the markets where everything is in place, right? Then you can take a market like South Africa, which, unlike the markets like Ghana and Guinea that I've spoken about, you actually have a chance to debate your regulator. Now, in our part of the world, if the regulator gives an instruction, you don't debate it. You obey before you complain. You try to comply before you come back. In their markets, they're actually able to debate the regulator and tell the regulator that what you have requested does not make sense. I would never dare do that in some of the West African regulatory countries. So it really depends on the market and what you really need to move forward. If you want speed, certain markets do not have all the regulatory red tape there yet, so you can get through really quickly. Sometimes there's no regulation, so you can just go in and launch, and the regulation catches up to you years later when you've already made your mark in the market. In other markets, you have a lot of direction, and so you have to follow the bureaucratic step-by-step process, which is comforting, but it also takes time. In another market, you have a regulator that basically engages with you, similar to how another fintech player would engage with you. So it allows easier dialogue, but spending too much time debating also doesn't bring a lot of progression. So it's really and it depends kind of scenario. But different markets have different advantages.
Yeah. So the same as even with the culture, the languages, everything, even with that one, you have to kind of sounds lead with humility, right? And understand how
100%.
things work, how to approach it, and also value not just the norms of the country and the regulations, but also again, relationships matter. That's what I can hear.
100%.
So, and again, that goes, yeah, a lot of the topic. Maybe Nicholas, also from your perspective in terms of regulations, policies? What are some of the insights you can share on this topic?
Sure. Thanks, Daniel. Well, like Jerry mentioned, there's not one market that would essentially give you the ultimate green light. I understand from each country, they're trying to protect their own interests. So if there are limits to capital movement, there are limits to ownership structures for foreign entities, all this is for the country's benefit. So I totally get that. So from the outside, you would assume there are lots of red tapes. It's preventing innovation. Regulators are stifling founders. You understand those themes. But from where I sit, it's more from the risk perspective. So we look at the market, we look at the company, we look at the startup, and then we look at the regulation. It's fine, for example, if blockchain is one regulation which is still pending. Lots of markets are still trying to understand it in actual depth. But then one thing you would also know is once the regulator figures it out, as a business, you should have not only made your mark, as Jerry mentioned, you should have gotten enough money to be able to fund these licenses as and when they come, because companies have come and gone. I think historically I've known people who built fintech enterprises and then the license thing kicked in, they couldn't raise enough money and their business had to shut down. So all these things are risks investors tend to look for. So in as much as there isn't maybe enough red tape or there isn't enough clarity in terms of what the regulator might look for, if you're moving, you move fast. First move advantage, you have to be moving very fast to as much as possible, make that mark so that you don't be moving quickly for no reason only to get shut down after a while. And you keep your eye on the horizon, keep your eye on other markets, try and judge the pace at which most of them are trying to essentially incorporate lessons from each other. So for example, the BOG and then I think the National Bank of Rwanda or National Rwanda Bank recently signed an MOU in terms of fintech passporting, where if you have a fintech in Ghana, you can to some degree. I don't know how it looks like on the execution end of it, but the MOU seems to want to allow fintech companies to operate similarly in terms of structure as you would in Ghana, and then you could use the same structure in Rwanda, which would enhance expansion just purely from a regulator perspective. So all these, I feel like, are introductions that are happening. There are interventions that are coming in, and Jerry mentioned it will take time. It's usually a long game. For those who've been there 10 years ago, they look at everything now, and yeah, it's pretty surprising how fast things change, either for the better or for some businesses for the worst.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you, dropped off.
Yeah. Yeah.
Are you back? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, Nicola, sorry, it seems I was lagging a bit. But I also want to ask a question around one of my favorite topics in business, and it's like talent. How you maintain, recruit great talent. And I think Jeremy made the point, like, yeah, if you cannot be absent from your business for a month, maybe even in your home market, then how are you going to do that in another country? But maybe like, because I know as a being in business how difficult it is already to hire and hire well within your home market. So what are kind of the challenges, nuances in terms of hiring? How do you go about it? Maybe if you go into your second country, who are the people? Are there people you take along to go build in the next country? Do they support, or what are the challenges in terms of having the right team for expansion in a new market? Yeah, maybe Jeremy, if you can go first on this.
Sure, yes. I understand why that would be one of your favorite topics because it's one I'm also a little quite passionate about. It's difficult to get really good talent, but it's not impossible. And it's only difficult because one, there is a certain culture and there's certain expectations that you have. And it's really about finding the kind of talent that not just meets the expertise aspect, but also fits into the kind of local leadership and culture that you're trying to build. That's not usually, it doesn't come already made. You kind of have to curate it as well. So if I were to give an advice about hiring, I'd say that be intentional about hiring. there's one thing that people tend to do when you're building a startup where it's like you don't have the time to put things on hold. But you see, the thing about hiring and going for local talent is you have to treat it as essential as building the platform itself. So if you know that you have to hire for talent, let's say you're trying to scale into a different market, you actually need to put things on hold and focus on that. Because, for example, if you get the right talent, what you're doing where you're having to double hat, triple hat is going to be substantially reduced. Maybe you go from triple hatting or quadruple hatting to just double hatting. So that is business critical aspect of your business, but you treat it like it's a side gig where you just try to find certain slots. You need to treat it like it's the next stage of your business where you put things on hold just to be intentional about the hiring. They say hire for attitude and train for skills, but if you can hire for attitude and skills, that is really good, right? I think that you try to make sure that you understand the local market that you're trying to hire in. If you are Ghanaian and you're based in Ghana, you're hiring other Ghanaians, you kind of know what to expect and what Ghanaians expect when you're coming into a role. But you go into a certain market where you're hiring and you realize that the expectations are completely different, right? In their mind, you telling them they need to work from 8 to 5, it's more like 10 to 2 to them. So you have to be clear that the way that things are done in that culture is different from the culture that you're trying to build internally. So so don't try to make everybody the same. What you need is people who have different talents, different capabilities that augment yours, but you need to really be intentional, right? Be humble in the recruitment because you're trying to bring in people who know things that you most likely don't. So yeah, that's my main thing. Be intentional. Try to hire both for attitude and for skills, but make sure that you are also going to curate and pay attention to the talent that you're bringing in a way that will pay dividends for you in the end. It's for your own benefit.
Yeah. Okay. Great. I mean, let's stay a little bit on that topic. Maybe Nicholas, your perspective on talent and hiring as well.
Yeah, hiring is an expensive feat. If you do it right and you're able to retain people, you would spend a lot less money than having to hire to lose, rehire. It's like Jerry was saying, it takes a lot of time. And imagine you having to put your business on hold to figure something out, only to realize you made the wrong hire and you do this process again in 3 months. It'll probably be a pain in anyone's butt. But for me, I would stand a bit more on the cultural fit perspective. In as much as you're looking for, which is important, diversity, because you need all these multiple perspectives, you need multiple talents, you need multiple insights from very different backgrounds. There has to be that cultural fit. Working for a US based firm would differ from working for a UK based or even a broader European type company, just from the cultural perspective. Working times are different, communication strategies are different. I know Ghana, we tend to want to figure it out on our own. Eventually, we do. We're very adaptable people. But then when you work for, let's say, a European company, and your boss is asking you how you feeling, and you just say, cool. In their mind, they're wondering, so what happened over the weekend? How are you really feeling? What happened today? So all these are cultural, and they're very slight, but then they're all cultural fits. Does this person believe in what we believe in? Does this person act the way we all seem to act? We are all different people, but does the cultural part align with us? And is he or she willing to, as much as possible, learn? Because you could be an exceptional CFO, but then if you can't relate with your CEO, you can't relate with your other C-suite members, you wouldn't become a bottleneck, but you become a bit harder to work with, and they would rather prefer a different profile or a different candidate. So I feel like in as much as we look for diversity, we try to as much as possible. If it's cultural appropriation, if it's you trying to input your culture in somebody, I don't stand for that. I'm not all about taking people and just bombarding them with. Then before you realize, you become a slave camp. You just indoctrination camp or something. I feel like seek out that diversity, but as much as you can, look for the slight cultural fits. You want a more outspoken person, you can figure this out in an interview. If you feel like your company is very conservative, you don't want social media people, the worst you can do is hire Gen Z ex social media influencer to lead, a certain arm of your company. So all these things are super important. I totally agree with Jeremy, but I'll just add a bit on the cultural fit.
Okay, I mean that's very interesting. Maybe you can go a little bit deeper into that uh, diversity. I mean, I don't think versus is the right verse, but diversity and cultural fit. This discussion, maybe on what Nicholas, or yeah, maybe based on what he said, maybe Jeremy, maybe you can elaborate a bit on how you look at diversity and how, maybe in your opinion, how diversity can lead to great or good outcomes.
Sure. I think I will steer clear from some of Nick's examples before he gets cancelled and I get pulled along with him, with him. But I agree. The my experience with diversity is sometimes you don't know your own blind spots, and having people coming in with different perspectives can point those blind spots out to you. For example, one of the things that we notice is when it comes to financial services on tech platforms, men tend to be more bold than women. So you tend to have a lot, majority of your customer base being men. And one of the things that we had a lady point out was that even in the agent network, let's say mobile money agent network, the guys are typically the agents. So most women are intimidated and will not go to some of these guys to learn. They would rather have the guys do it for them rather than teach them. However, if you replace these agents with female agents, the women are more comfortable learning from these agents. So if you wanted to do something like drive, women uptake, it would be good if you had more women agents to drive the process. As a guy, that is the blind spot that I had because I was not really thinking about it from that angle, and I wouldn't even notice that because we tend to be more pragmatic and just focus on the bottom line and the outcomes and the numbers to see if we're growing. And we're not really thinking about making sure that the impact is felt. So having that diversity, in this case, gender diversity, is really great. If you're trying to scale across markets, then hiring local talent brings a lot of diversity in terms of the differences in thinking. Certain markets you go to, you have to adjust the products to the local languages. In Ghana, we have predominantly English. Predominantly English is our predominant business language, so most products would be facilitated in English. But if you went down east to, let's say, Tanzania for a long time only spoke Swahili, so English is basically their second language for a lot of people. So it's difficult for you to just go into the market and understand the lay of the land and assume that everybody um, let me not say difficult, but if you did that, you would put yourself in a difficult position because one, it's not just about translating the language into a manner that people understand. It's about the localized storytelling that you put within the product. So hiring, let's say, a country manager or country directions operations manager there can tell you that there is no word that exists for loan in, let's say, in Swahili, right? The word that you are using is actually is basically indicating that people who take your product are poor, and it creates a wrong connotation. So rather than just using the direct translation that you think is loan, use it and frame it in this way, right? That is something that you would not be able to know on your own, right? Also, there's a founder behavior and approach to doing business versus an operator's approach to doing business. A founder needs to be that bulldozer who does not take no for an answer, who does not lose his steam, who basically is constantly looking forward and is on to the next. Whereas more of the operator's mindset is to make sure that he's fixing things as he goes and he's pinpointing the nuances and the details that the founder probably may have missed because the founder is focused on securing the big deal, securing the big partnership, launching, and basically you leave, that duct tape in your wake. So it's good to have somebody who complements your skills, and that could be a form of diversity as well. So it's important to have both the gender diversity, the cultural diversity, but also the sort of the skills gap diversity so that you make sure that you're covering all bases. But it's essentially to make sure that you minimize the blind spots that you have within your business as much as possible because you see something that others don't, and they will also see something that you don't. So it's basically complementary skill sets that the diversity comes in to bridge.
Okay, I mean, I think that was a great elaboration on how you look at it and how diversity can be critical from different perspectives. But what I'm also wondering, yes, like reducing the blind spots, everything was very critical. At the same time, how to maintain like fast feedback loops and decision making in a company that is now going, let's say, expanding at the same time, hiring diverse people in different markets? How do you ensure to kind of, let's say, that entrepreneurial speed, the decision making? How can you ensure that that also scales? I think to some extent, of course, at some point it will have to slow down, but how do you ensure that that stays as long as possible?
Is that a Nick question or a Jeremy question?
So sorry, yeah, sorry. That was a follow up to Jeremy. I would also like to hear Nicholas' perspective after that, but maybe Jeremy, that was kind of a follow up question to what you just said. I'm wondering
Sure,
around about that.
sure. I'm going to echo something that Nick said, right? The reality that you have to accept is that when it comes to people, you are never going to get it 100% right. All you can do is your best, because you know the age-old conundrum: you hire people, train them, incorporate them, and then they will eventually leave. So keeping them is going to be hard. All you can try to do is reduce those instances. So the first thing is prioritize people, right? Prioritize the recruiting, prioritize the diversity. Make sure that you have it as a priority, because the value that somebody can give you in a year of you having them is going to be it's going to pay dividends going forward. So just because there's a possibility that they could come in, learn what they want, and be poached or move on to something else, does not mean that you should not invest in them and prioritize them as they are there. So that's one of the things. The second thing is you have to create your own internal feedback loop, right? There's lots of tools that you use to make sure that you actually understand what motivates people beyond, let's call it the remuneration package, right? And what I've observed in the tech space, smart people are attracted to work with other smart people. If you get the hiring of the initial smart people wrong, and somebody is coming in and realizes that I'm not going to learn a lot, not just from the company, but from the people that I'm going to be working with, you don't retain that kind of talent, right? Smart people want to work with smart people. So if you want to like recruit for expertise, make sure that you are recruiting for expertise from the beginning, because they are the ones who will attract other smart people. And even when things are not going right with the company, on their personal journey, they know that there's more beyond the tangible remuneration package that they can get. And then the feedback loop, in my experience, is making sure that the feedback it goes both ways. It's non-judgmental. There's this 360 feedback that doesn't really exist in the large corporate spaces, where feedback is usually top down, right? Nicholas is the managing director. He tells everybody what he's observed. And if you are lucky and he says, okay, what do you have to tell me? Most people will not be transparent. They will tell you the surface level things just so that they can continue about their business with no trouble. But if you, the leader, are able to establish that you are able to stand in front of an audience and take critical and sometimes harsh feedback and accept that, one, if this many people are talking about this thing about me, there must be some truth to it, and I'm going to work on that, and display to the company that you are also, taking feedback well, or taking feedback and incorporating it. It creates a culture where that kind of 360 feedback loop remains a valuable and integral part of the company's culture, and it's a really good way to make sure that the culture of people is maintained and people are able to feel empowered and go about the business that they do. So those are my 2 cents. You never will get it 100%. All you can do is your very best, and just step out of your comfort zone a little bit. So maybe I'll pass on to Nick to see what you think about that.
Yeah, Jeremy, I feel like you've touched on everything I was thinking. Just get the brilliant people in and then create that system for them to work. And that involves hiring the right people for them to work with. Because, yeah, smart people like to work with smart people. I think even in football terms, Ronaldo left what team? Man U to Real Madrid because of the stars of Real Madrid. He felt these are people who can help me become who I want to be or become better than what I think I should be. And eventually the talent will move. You'd be surprised. Money does little after a while. Maybe the person joined the job because the person was hard on cash, but after a while, the money means very little. It boils down to culture. Who am I working with? How does my boss allow me to feel about the things I'm doing? Does my boss listen to the things I tell him or her? Am I allowed to express different? So that's what the feedback loop comes in. Am I allowed to express my intention? Am I allowed to express how I feel about certain decisions? Are they taken into consideration? And it's mirrored. What you are as a CEO, what you are as a general manager, what you are as a founder would be mirrored from the bottom as well, because then they look at you and they're like, okay, so he's doing this. Why should I care? Why should I give a damn about what's happening? I'll just do my best and do my bare minimum. And you realize how fast productivity dips when the will to work just goes out, because people every day pull out different stops to make things happen. Most of these things are intangible, you can't really measure, but you don't want to put them in that space where you're frustrating a group of very brilliant people. You haven't created a system for them to work, the environment for them to be able to learn from each other, and push the company, because most of them would have personal interest in the company scaling, and that depends on ESOP. If you have shares from an employee perspective, you want to push the company as far as it can go. But then at some point, you'd realize the environment is what makes the people. So high level, you'd have to focus internally, and both internally and externally, where you create the system for them. But then in that system, you are driving that growth amongst everybody. People are rational. They would eventually figure out people. Your boss will eventually figure you out as a person. You figure your boss out as a person. But then bottom line is, just get the brilliant people into a good system and watch them make the magic happen.
Yeah. I mean, now we have been thinking around, yes, what's the foundation, the people, the regulatory aspects of scaling. But I mean, as last question, what I would like to understand or see your opinion on is in terms of what are the possibilities to even scale beyond Africa? What are maybe even examples you have seen, or do you see that in the future there is more opportunities for African tech scale ups that get it right to even go beyond the continent? Because this is all in the terms of, yes, scaling across Africa, but maybe what are the opportunities to scale outside of Africa? And maybe is there even sometimes the opportunity that it might be even more conducive for certain startups to go in that direction? Let's go Jeremy first, and then Nicholas after that for the same question.
Sure. Yes, I think that's a very good question, right? Because the thing is, for example, in our space, we tend to focus a lot on the inclusive market, right? The informal economy that is not really given all the fintech products that are out there. So we try to bring them in as much as possible. Within Africa, like it's a $1.5 trillion, informal economy that is largely unbanked. But when you think about it, if you go beyond the borders, or the borders, the continent of Africa, to like Latin America, to parts of Asia as well, they also have the same large informal economy, right? Now, the convergence of things like mobile money, digital ID, data, allows you a chance to deliver things like credit, savings, insurance at scale. And it doesn't actually only have to be within the borders or the regions of Africa, right? I know a credit provider in Nigeria that started in Nigeria, and then their next market was actually in Mexico, right? Is because when they did their comparative analysis, they realized that the same conditions that existed that made them successful in Nigeria existed in Mexico, and they had the kind of network and connections there as well that would facilitate an easier entry over there. So because Africa is so fragmented and so diverse, that your experience within Africa actually would apply outside of the continent, because it's basically like going to another African country. Just have to follow the same principles of understanding the culture, learning the regulations, making the right partnerships. And I think that things like embedded finance, trying to do cross-border remittances, especially to wallets and not just to accounts, is going to be quite an untapped market that people need to start looking into. I think it's going to become quite prominent in the next couple of years. As long as you can crack the distribution to the last mile, you'll win the game.
Okay, great. And Nicholas, any thoughts on, yes, African startup scale up, scaling beyond Africa?
Yeah, totally agree with Jeremy. I'm just remembering a founder told me she's trying to scale this solution across Africa. My whole theme, my whole tagline is for Africa. But then my first customer is coming from Brazil. Like, what on earth do I do at that point? Because I'm building this solution for Africa, but somebody from Brazil thinks there's some value in what I'm building. Should I take this contract? And so these are all thoughts the founders go through. But in my opinion, as Jeremy mentioned, there's so many similarities across these continents. You'd be very surprised. I think even for most people, when they scale, the first market they tend to look for is Latin America, because they feel like, I feel like this solution could do well in that market as well. And once there are customers who are willing to pay, my product is scaling. There are people who are willing to, because maybe cracking Africa might be a different beast, might be a different animal, but who's to say you can't tap into others and try, even from an exploratory perspective, R&D, why don't you want to test it out and see what your product can do? And with all these processes, when you're building and you're measuring and you're learning, you can actually launch mildly in another market and just see or get customer feedback, just to get some validation in terms of what markets can I expand to. And expansion is pretty much not limited to your imagination. It's more on the ground. So if you're sitting at home thinking my product is for Africa, it's built by an African, it's for Africa, but you'd be very surprised somebody looks at your product, copies it, and creates the same thing in Latin America when you could have just tapped into that market a little, just to explore. So these are all like just conundrums founders face, scaling. I want to scale for Africa, but then there's a whole market beyond Africa. I'm scared to touch that market because I don't know it. But hey, you don't know Madagascar, which is in Africa as well. What stops you from taking a trip exploratory just to even talk with a regulator in another country? And you'd be surprised, they'll probably mention the same things Bank of Ghana have mentioned in terms of getting an MFB license, for example, and you want to build a digital bank or a fintech. So I feel like, yeah, in my opinion, go for it. Tap into that market. You don't have to launch resources into that market. You can measure, you can learn from different markets, and you'd be very surprised what the other continents have to offer. They might even be more willing buyers. And then that buys you more time in terms of runway, money to keep your Africa dream alive. Because yeah, we're all Pan-African, we all want the continent to succeed, and you need time most of the time. So in my opinion, if you see a market that you can scale to beyond Africa, just spend enough time learning, spend enough time measuring what exactly you want to do and how you could do it. And if the other players in the space, go under them, just learn what they are doing. How do they crack the market? What's the slight cultural thing you feel like if I inject into this product could give it that lift off in another country? So that's pretty much my very small 2 cents on this. I don't know if Daniel, you have any other questions, but yeah, I think we're here for a few more minutes. So
Yeah, I mean, I'm coming to wrap it up. I mean, the reason why I asked this particular question was because when you listen to the answers, right? Especially, I think Jeremy explicitly mentioned be humble, humility, 2, 3 times. And I always feel like entrepreneurship is like so fascinating in the sense that you need to have like ambition, be daring, and have all of like these ability to think outside the box. And at the same time, you have to be really humble and assume you don't know. And that's why I also asked that question if going beyond Africa, because I think founders, entrepreneurs need to have like that ambition and that, in quotes, sometimes it's like a good footballer like that. Since Nicholas went to football analogy, you have a certain level of arrogance, in quotes, to do certain things that others wouldn't do. I mean, Jeremy also pointed at the founder type. But at the same time, you need to be humble enough to go do your training every morning, check what others are doing, ask yourself whether it's right or wrong. And I think it's a fascinating mix. But maybe to end it, we have 1 minute, maybe one sentence each of advice. What should aspiring founders do that want to become like world-changing innovators, but they find themselves, let's say, in Ghana? What's the single advice you would give, Nicholas?
in a sentence, I would say, well, scaling in Africa is built on a foundation of resilience. You have to be resilient, you have to be adaptable, and you have to do the work. You have to put in the work to understand both your local markets and the markets you're trying to target. So, in 3 words, you build, you measure, and then you learn, and then you keep that loop going. So, as you learn, you keep building. As you keep building, you keep measuring. As you keep measuring, you keep learning.
Nice. Jeremy, what about you? What's the single advice?
Mine is a little bit cliche, right? It's think global but act local. I know we say it a lot, but it's really important to observe, learn, take into context the global best practices. Most of the products that we're trying to do have been done somewhere else in the world. So think global in the sense that look at what's being done elsewhere. Don't always try and reinvent the wheel. But also have your expectations that that is where you eventually want to get to, right? If your first customer is Brazilian, start thinking about how you can make this happen in Brazil. But when you start, act local. Look at where you are, look at where you're starting, understand the market nuances, the people, the culture, the language, the local context, and storytelling, and build your product to match those needs. So you think global, but you act local. I think it's one of the best mindsets to have for any founder who's looking to grow and scale across borders.
Yeah, I think that's the perfect note to end this episode of In the Box. Thanks so much to Jeremy and Nicholas for sharing their knowledge, know how, and insights. And yeah, see you next month with another episode of In the Box. Thanks, guys. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for having us. Thanks for the conversation. Cheers.
Bye.
Cheers. Bye. Bye, Kweba. Yeah, you can send them the link as long as they're on the same machine. You'll figure it out. Bye bye.